You're listening to episode 747 of the Father Bills Podcast. Welcome back. This week's episode is entitled, Become What You Receive, given on the solemnity of the Body and Blood of Christ, 2020. In this time of pandemic and the subsequent government, we could say not lockdown, but quarantine, I suppose, and as it has spread, I have been amazed at our parishioners. I've been amazed at their devotion, often expressed, strangely enough, in disappointment. Is that a weird thing to put together? Their devotion has been expressed in disappointment because of the unavailability of the Eucharist. Their not being able to receive the Eucharist has caused disappointment. So this is not like just any other thing. This disappointment is not a misplaced feeling, just like being angry at injustice. That's a well-placed emotion. But I see this as a reflection of how important the sacrament of the Eucharist is to our people, to our community of Catholics. In addition, it was inspiring to hear the many ways, sometimes a little bit humorous, but the many ways they were trying to configure it so that they could still receive Eucharist, whether it be out in a parking lot or a drive-through, or those are a lot of different ideas. Now, it is clear that we cannot separate the Eucharist from the liturgy. In the norm, we don't do that. We give the Eucharist to people who are homebound because they're homebound and because they're sick. But in this case, in Mass, we're not prepared. And the Archbishop was pretty clear that, what we'll do is we'll have private Masses for the now, receive spiritual communions until we can start opening up more. And I'm happy to report that this weekend we'll be able to, at St. Anne and our missions, be able to open up quite a bit so that those who have signed up are certainly going to be there, and there's quite a few. But I can also tell you I did a sneak peek, and although the sign-ups are closed, there is plenty of room for more people to come. And so if you want to come, you just need to make sure you sign in. This is really important. You can't get in without signing in. We have to do that for the contact tracing situation. We want to make sure that if there is some kind of illness that you would be contacted, because then you could be notified, well, hey, you were maybe around somebody who had COVID or you were possibly exposed. So, but theologically speaking and liturgically speaking, the Eucharist doesn't come to us outside of the Eucharist. The Eucharist doesn't come to us outside of the liturgy. It's the liturgy itself that you could say gives us the Eucharist. The Second Vatican Council, Sacrosanctum Concilium, its very first document was on the sacred liturgy, and it spoke about the sacred liturgy being the source and the summit. It didn't actually say the Eucharist per se is the source and summit. Although, by extension, we can make those statements. We can say the Eucharist, which is the pinnacle of the liturgical celebration of the Mass, which is the source and summit, then we can sometimes say, in antiquity we've said this, we're going to Eucharist. We as Latin-based Christians, we say we go to Mass. Mass is a Latin-based word. If you talk to Eastern Rite Christians, they will not use the word Mass. They would use another word like sacred liturgy. They're using their base of language, whether it be Greek, whether it be Russian, whether it be whatever it might be. If they're Latin-based, like us, which makes Roman Catholics, then we would say Mass. So parishioners then coming back to Mass, we had like 25 in the last couple of weeks. Now we can do up to, our numbers are more like 136 or something like that, if everybody is an individual and there's 6 feet around them. But I know that even in this little chapel, we have 2 couples here and 2 couples there, and that kind of just doubles that number from 2 to 4, and you're still maintaining the 6 feet, I see. That's good. So that means that while our numbers for signups only are 136, there's actually more capacity because we have this space opened up. We have the church itself opened up. We're not going just every other pew. We're going like 3 and then 2 and then 3 and then 2. And then again, that's based on individuals. And when there's a family unit, they can just all clump together. So we actually had a funeral on Tuesday. We had probably about 150 people in the main body of the church. So that kind of tells you how, depending on how people come, whether they're in a family unit, a household unit or not, they can either be part of that or they come by themselves, and again, they have to be 6 feet away. We also still have the parish center as an option, and that there's people that have signed up for that as well. That's kind of more of our overflow, but we have a feed that will go from the church here to the parish center. So given even these restrictions, some people have been able to come to Mass, and it's just amazing to watch their amazement. I say the body of Christ. And some are kind of like, not sure what to say. It's been a while. They're having this, wait a second, is this real? And while some of the statistics have been shown that some Catholics don't believe in the real presence, I've not personally seen that statistic in play. In other words, if there's a large number that don't believe, I'm not sure they're coming to St. Anne, and if they are, they're mimicking awe and amazement, to me anyway. Only a few people actually are really careless when receiving the Eucharist and maybe walk away. We've had to make sure people are instructed that if you have a mask on, to remove the mask before you receive. Some people wanted to put get the Eucharist and then open up their mask and kind of stick it in underneath their mask. I'm like, okay, but people are walking away doing that. We ask, you receive the Eucharist and eat it right there and then you walk away. So that's just some thoughts. But it's just, the bottom line is I'm amazed, and it's inspiring to me, now that we're opening up some more, at the faith of our people. And that does affect me and effect me. I feel it. And then it makes me think, wow, how can we then make this more available to more people? Being more, trying to think a little harder about things. Where when the numbers were really low, it was actually pretty simple. 25 people, boom, and at one point it was 10. And we were like, well, okay, there's no creativeness going on there. But now, we can't really get 250 people in our church at this point, but boy, we've thought about it. How could we do that while keeping people safe? Because that's important. Remember, I'm not a person of a conspiracy theory here. I don't believe, and nor does the Archbishop believe, that this the quarantine or the numbers that have been dished out for churches, etc., has been a way to thwart religion. That's something I don't prescribe to. That's nothing the Archbishop prescribes to. Because number one, we are here to keep people healthy because we're pro-life. Remember this. And so given what doctors and professionals have said, we believe what they're saying. There's no interest for them to do such strange things as conspiracy theory or government takedowns and all that kind of stuff. So I'll leave the conspiracy theorists to themselves in that regard. In the meantime, we as people of faith have been given the sacrament of the Eucharist, and we're able to receive it now more because we're more available to it. So I want to leave one quote from one of my favorite saints with all of you, and that is from St. Augustine. And maybe you know what quote this is. I'm about to say it, but it's one that he's really famous for. He says this: become what you receive. Become what you receive. And he's referring to the Eucharist when he says this. This is a theological statement that should make us go, what? See, the Eucharist is not just normal food. We sometimes can call it bread because it has the accidents of bread. And this is a technical word. This ambo here, we call it an ambo. That's what it is. But it's made of wood, right? It's still made of wood. If you go back, 200 years, we wouldn't call it an ambo. We'd call it a tree or a little sapling. But the stuffness, the accidents are wood. The accidents never change, no matter how we reconfigure this thing. Even if we burn it, we would say, well, the DNA was wood. Didn't become metal. Doesn't change what it is. But it did go from a tree to an ambo. These are technical terms, but it's important because I once had a discussion with someone of another faith tradition who did not believe in the Eucharist and was challenging me like, well, so then if at the end of the Mass we got a microscope, is that the DNA of Jesus? I'm like, whoa. You don't understand what we're talking about then. See, there's philosophical understandings that is completely missed here. We believe that there are the essence of something and there's the accidents of something. We're not like, I tripped and I fell. Not that. The qualities about something. Some people in our own faith tradition have said, well, I'm going to receive the Eucharist and I can't get COVID because of that. My response to that is, you have a very poor understanding of the Eucharist, because the accidents, that is, the cellular structure, does not change. If you put the Eucharist, a host, under a microscope before consecration and after consecration, you're going to be seriously surprised that it didn't change, because we're not talking about the accidents changing. It will still taste like bread. Same thing with the precious wine, right? We consecrate it. If you took a look at the accidents, if you drank too much of it before the consecration, you might get drunk. Well, and if you drank too much after it was consecrated, you still would get drunk. So it is not a protection against, because of its being consecrated, sickness. Now, by the way, there's always this little asterisk in these moments of theology, because there's always miracle, in the sense of God is going to choose to heal somebody because of and through this particular means. But by the normative sense, well, I can speak for myself. I get colds and I receive the Eucharist a lot. It has not healed me from the cold. God has not gifted me in that way. He is doing the normative way that he's giving us the sacrament, which is the accidents stay the same. The species is another way we refer it. But the essence changes. When we bring it forward, we would say, it is bread. It is wine. But after the consecration, it is Christ's body and blood. In fact, the fullness of body and blood in both species. Are you following me? I hope you're following me, because this is important. So, it's not normal bread. See, when I eat something, I ingest it like a piece of bread. Like I love raisin bread. Do you like raisin bread? I like raisin bread. As a kid, I used to put cinnamon on it, and bread is awesome. God was really smart about that one, right? So, but when we eat bread, the nutrients are taken into our body, and it becomes us, right? It builds our cell structure. Our heart is better if we're eating better food, like whole wheat bread, as opposed to potato bread, which potato bread's almost like sugar. But if we're eating foods that are good for us, it builds our body. We talk to any nutritionist, right? This is a fact. That stuff becomes us. It's what creates our bodies. And if we don't have it, our body just deteriorates and we die. That's what happens on the normative side of the effects or the accidents of the Eucharist. We do get the nutrients. I don't know what an actual host in calories is, but it can't be much, right? You don't live by bread alone. And in that case, if it's just bread alone, you got a bag of hosts, right, that have not been consecrated, you'll last for a little while, but not for a long time. What Augustine is trying to say is that the Eucharist is the reverse of this. The essence of what the Eucharist is Jesus Christ. And when we receive him, he's challenging us and hoping for us and informing us that we may become like that one whom we are receiving. We are receiving Jesus Christ. We are being pulled into his reality. We're becoming an alter Christus in Latin. Another Christ. That's what our calling is, to be another Christ. In fact, if you go back to the beginning, we were made in the image and likeness of God. And we messed it up. Here's the brain buster. If you took a little graph, we were in communion with God. Adam and Eve, they were in communion with each other, with God, with nature. And we messed it up. But God had a plan from the beginning to do it one better than that. That we would become in communion with him more than Adam and Eve. Catching this? Adam and Eve didn't have the Eucharist. The flesh of Adam and Eve did not become the flesh of God. But our flesh gets pulled into the flesh, sacramentally, of God. We become more like Christ. That's another way of putting it. It might be a little easier to digest in our head, right? We become like Christ. We're called to be that way. That's our call. As a baptized Christian, we are we're baptized in his priestly, prophetic, and kingly nature. And when we receive the Eucharist, we get more pulled into that reality. I hope you're following this, because this is important that we understand these differences, because this will help us and keep us safe from being superstitious or ignorant or looking for the molecules of the host and wondering why it didn't change. That argument is completely not what we believe. If you gnaw on this ambo here, it's going to be tasting like wood. You might get a splinter. Right? If you gnaw on the Eucharist, you'll get some calories, but you're going to receive Christ. I just hope you're open to it. I hope I'm open to it. See, the grace that can... Here's another thing. So people have made comments about the spiritual communion. And our wording sometimes gives it an impression that it's something less than. Well, the pinnacle of a communion is this Eucharist. So anything other, you might say, is something a little bit less, but it's still Jesus. It's still a communion. It's just not a sacramental communion. So by our receiving this Eucharist, we come into a fuller communion, and we become like we were called to be from the beginning and more. From in the beginning, God made them male and female, and they were made in the likeness and image of God. And now we become in the likeness and image of God in the person of Jesus Christ. And we know Jesus Christ. And by receiving him, we come into an intimate union. He's the lover, we're the beloved. There's a marital analogy going on here too, by the way. That we are one flesh. That in the receiving of the Eucharist, we come in an intimate communion. What greater communion for a couple, a husband and wife, is there? And Jesus then uses this image, the sacrament of marriage, with the sacrament of the Eucharist. And we see this throughout the whole Bible, really. But in the book of Revelation, we hear about this, that he's the bridegroom and we're the bride. And when we receive this Eucharist, we are once again consummating the love covenant between us. Wow, huh? Well, given all that stuff, if you're going to church today, or if you're going to receive communion this week, do not receive it just as mere bread. There's breadness about it, right? The accidents are there. Smells like bread, looks like bread, but is it? We would say no. It has become the body, blood, soul, and divinity, the true presence of Jesus, the Son of God, the second person of the Blessed Trinity, the one who suffered, was crucified, died, rose, and ascended into heaven, and is at the right hand of the Father. So in essence, allow yourself to become more like him. We use a word that gets misunderstood, and it's called divinization. This is an Eastern word that they use a lot, more than Catholics' word. We don't become divine. We're not gods. But we come more in the image of God by the receiving of the Eucharist. We are divinized. We encounter him. Think about this. Use that marital analogy. Husbands and wives, do not become, in many ways, akin to the other. Don't you find yourself like dressing similarly? Do you not sometimes actually plan on matching when you go somewhere? Or case, if you're going to go to like a party, don't you do like you dress in a way that somehow you connect, you get a theme going on, right? Don't you start thinking about the same things? Don't you start sometimes loving the same things? Now, I'm not saying this is absolute, because sometimes this isn't the case. But love permeates the relationship, and you become more akin to each other. So too with the Eucharist. With the one flesh union of the Eucharist, the pinnacle, we become more of what our essence is meant to be. We are to be alter Christus, another Christ to the world. So that when you receive this Eucharist, don't keep it to yourself. I'm not saying take it out of your mouth and give it to somebody. I'm not being literal in that sense. But take what you have experienced. This lover, Jesus Christ, you being the beloved, become what you receive. And go out and share that. Share what it's like to be more than humanity was from the beginning, because of Christ, because of this amazing gift of the sacrament of the Eucharist. Thank you again for listening to this episode of the Father Bill's podcast. If you have any comments or questions or anything of curiosity you want to ask me about, I just invite you to go to my website, fatherbill.org, FRBILL.org, and there you can email me, go to my Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc., and I'll do my best to get right back to you. In the meantime, may God bless you and stay safe. Bye-bye.